A very good evening to you and a warm welcome to The Globe on SABC News. It is 10 p.m. Central African time and we're coming to you from the SABC Centre in Johannesburg. I'm Simpiwe Ngwane. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a look at what's making news headlines. 2 American astronauts shot into orbit a little earlier in the first of its kind spaceflight collaboration between private company SpaceX and NASA. The total number of coronavirus cases in South Africa now sits at close to 31,000. And violent protests are continuing to spread across the United States, the 4th straight day following the death of George Floyd, an unarmed African American allegedly at the hands of the police. Also coming up this hour, Brits headed to parks and beaches across England on Saturday, just days before lockdown measures are set to be eased. Violent protests are continuing to spread across the United States, the 4th straight day after George Floyd, an unarmed African American, pleaded, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe," before dying in police custody in Minneapolis, the biggest city in the Midwest state of Minnesota. The New York police said at least 9 people were arrested and some police officers injured during clashes between protesters and police.
Fires burned and protesters took to the streets in cities across the US for the 4th night of violent protests over the killing of an unarmed black man at the hands of officers in Minneapolis. Around 500 demonstrators clashed again with police on Friday evening in Minneapolis, defying an 8 p.m. curfew. Others burned cars and looted stores. Officers opened fire with tear gas, plastic bullets and concussion grenades. In Atlanta, protesters threw rocks and broke windows at the headquarters of news network CNN and very nearly broke their way into the building.
That video that you're witnessing right now and looking at now, it was intense to say the least.
In Washington, police and Secret Service agents were out in force around the White House before dozens of demonstrators gathered across the street in Lafayette Square. Authorities had hoped the arrest of one of the officers involved would calm tensions. Derek Chauvin was charged with murder in the case on Friday. Graphic video footage showed him kneeling on the neck of 46-year-old black man George Floyd as he was gasping for air and pleading for help.
To get a sense of the ongoing protests across the United States, we've asked correspondent Nick Harper to join us live from Washington, D.C. Nick, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. A warm welcome to The Globe. What is the latest?
Well, there's certainly some concern across the United States that potentially we're heading into the 5th night of some very severe protests right across the United States, not just in the city of Minneapolis. As we saw from those pictures there has been violent protests, there has been looting, but there has also been a tremendous sense of outrage and a sense of injustice from African American communities right across the US. There were protests in about 30 major cities on Friday night, and the fear is that on Saturday night, a few hours away from now, that potentially those protests could grow in scale. Now, in the state of Minnesota, where Minneapolis is, the governor has upped the police presence there. He's introduced an extra 1,000 National Guard to be ready and on standby and on the streets of Minneapolis tonight. And he's also put a number of military armed units on call as well, potentially looking for them to be called in if trouble arises during the course of the evening. But they did admit early on Saturday morning that so far they had massively underestimated the scale of the protests, but also the sense of the outrage that we have seen. So we are a few hours away from heading into evening time here in the United States, and there is that concern that those protests will continue and potentially be even larger for the 5th night.
Well, in an afternoon news conference, Minnesota officials asked residents of Minnesota, to stay at home and forgo that protest, to stay at home after 8 p.m. so that law enforcement could remove the folks who are harming them. Is there a sense that people are heeding to those calls?
Well, that curfew was the same curfew that was in place on Friday night, that 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. curfew for the city of Minneapolis. And of course, we saw many hundreds of people not heeding that, still going out onto the streets, still going to protest, and some of them engaged in violence act as well, setting police cars and other vehicles on fire as well. So it's unclear whether people will heed that. From what we've seen over the last few nights, I feel that it's probably unlikely that people will decide that come 8 p.m. it's time to head indoors. We're likely to continue to see that sense of outrage and that feeling of injustice playing out on the streets of Minneapolis.
Well, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has estimated that about 20% of the protesters are from Minnesota and about 80% are from outside the state. So now one then wonders, Nick, why is that important? Because this problem affects just about everybody across the United States.
Well, that's right. That's something that the President, Donald Trump, has been tweeting about as well. He's put the figure even higher. He said that 80% of the people out on the streets, and he called them rioters in particular, those people who were out there setting fire to buildings over the last few nights, he estimates that 80% of them come from out of state. And that's important because it is a federal crime to cross state lines and then to be engaged in those acts of violence. It's something that obviously the President, but also the Governor, as you mentioned, want to discourage. People in the US are allowed to protest peacefully, and that is something that they want to happen. They don't want to see the violence that we've seen over the last few nights reenacted again this evening.
Well, Governor Tim Walz also said that the situation is no longer about the murder of George Floyd, but it's certainly about attacking civil society and instilling fear. But then the question is, who is attacking who? And is that the case, though, as the popular sentiment, Nick, is that this attack was racially charged?
Well, the original killing of George Floyd, the feeling is that undoubtedly this was just another example of police brutality, where we have a white police officer and a black unarmed man who ends up dying at the hands of the police, something that we've seen on a number of occasions over the last several years, many of them high-profile cases like this that have sparked protests, that have sparked that feeling of injustice in African-American communities. Digging, of course, on the past that runs all the way back to the end of slavery here in the United States, right through the civil rights movement, through to present day. There is that feeling that many African-American citizens are treated by police as second-class citizens, that there is a level of police brutality inflicted upon them that is not inflicted upon white civilians. So there is certainly that feeling, not just in the city of Minneapolis, but right across the country. And I think that is why we have seen really that anger, that outrage bubble over and become so much more than just peaceful protests over the last few nights.
Well, apart from saying that this violence could be attributed to, it was racially charged and it was attributed to the radical left, that is President Donald Trump tweeting earlier on. So in terms of just showing solidarity with the Floyd family, do we know at this point whether he has been in touch or whether officials from the White House have been in touch with the George Floyd family?
Well, we're told that the President did speak to members of George Floyd's family earlier on in the week. He has talked about his killing, describing it as tragic. But there is also that concern amongst African-American communities that the President isn't doing enough to denounce that level of police brutality. And not just that, that he's going on to incite violence. That's something that he's been called out for doing this week. You may remember a couple of days ago he sent out a tweet that then Twitter effectively censored because they said that it was inciting violence. He said that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Now that was directly quoting the police chief of Miami, who said that back in 1967, a comment that was very much at the height of the civil rights movement here in America, an anti-civil rights comment threatening a violent retaliation against those civil rights protesters. And the feeling is that if President Trump is able to quote such feelings and such sentiments as that, then he is not on the side of African American communities. He's been tweeting throughout the course of today, and he even first thing this morning invited pro-presidential President Trump supporters to come out here this evening to the White House to hold a Make America Great Again rally, essentially a counter rally to the Black Lives Matters protests that we've seen right across the US. So there is that feeling that perhaps the President isn't exactly doing things to tamp down the feelings of repression across the US. He was even asked about it earlier, whether or not he was worried that he was stoking racial violence. He said to the reporters there that no, not at all. He said that he was in support of African Americans, and he said that his supporters loved black people. He said, "Make America Great Again loves the black people." But of course, there are many within the African community who feel that that is simply not true.
Now, the United States remains the epicenter of the coronavirus worldwide. Now, in terms of social distancing, I see that in the background, people are still going on about their lives. And then just about in terms of ensuring that people stick by the regulations about social distancing and about these protests, have any law enforcement agencies or agents arrested people then?
Well, not for not wearing masks. It doesn't seem as if there's been any arrests made as a result of people not wearing masks. There have been arrests in many major cities, but not for that. I mean, we have seen some protesters out wearing masks, even the one today. And just before I came on air with you, there was a march of hundreds of people, potentially as many as 1,000, streaming past the White House here, carrying signs and chanting. Many of them were wearing masks as well. But I think we have to bear in mind that with the US leading the world with the highest death toll for COVID-19, with the highest number of cases, and the fact that it reached that grim milestone this week of having 100,000 deaths, all of that happening at a time when we are seeing these protests, there is that feeling amongst African American communities who are the hardest hit by this pandemic here in the US. They are dying in far greater numbers than white populations. There is that feeling of unease, that bubbling up of frustration within those communities that not enough is being done to help them, and then there is this police brutality on top of that at a time when many of them are perhaps losing their jobs. Here in the US, the unemployment rate is now up to about 15%. About 40 million Americans have lost their jobs. All of those things combined, the pandemic, the police brutality, and people are out of work and unable to gainfully earn money at this time, I think is creating this sense of tension and this unease, and we are heading into perhaps a very difficult weekend, a very difficult evening where we may see more protests and potentially escalating violence.
All right, Nick Harper, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. That was our correspondent, Nick Harper, joining us via Skype, which is giving us an update about the protests that are ongoing across the United States as a result of the murder of George Floyd.